I was asking some of my family members what they had experienced in our house. My stepdaughter lived with us from the age of 17 to 18, and she stayed in the room that our son stays in now. She told me one night she went to use the bathroom and shower, and she had a conversation with a woman that she thought was me. The door was shut, so she thought I was sitting on her bed talking to her because whatever it was mimicked my voice, and she had a 20-minute conversation with whatever it was. Now I remember this happening because my husband and me were in the living room with our son watching TV. I remember her coming in the living room telling me it was rude to just walk off in the middle of our conversation, and my husband and I told her I hadn't got up off the couch at all since she had went to her room. My husband's experience. And this one happened when our son was around 3 or 4 years old. I had wrecked my car, so my mother had come and got me and my little boy. My husband had come home from work, and he knew I was with my mother, but he came in and saw a woman that looked like me walk into our bedroom. He had a 3 or 4 minute conversation with her. He was in the living room. He lays his paperwork from work on a table in the living room, goes into our bedroom, and the woman he was talking to was gone. He goes back into the living room to call me, and the paperwork he had laid down was ripped into pieces. My oldest sister's experience. Our ex has custody of their daughter, and they live in Ohio. We live in Tennessee. He brought my niece down for the summer to let her stay at my house. My sister stayed here while she was here, and they stayed in our son's bedroom. My sister said she woke up to an eerie feeling and looked in the corner of the room, and the little girl that my son called Little Sarah because he didn't know her name was sitting in the corner squatting with her elbows on her knees and her hands propping her face up just looking at my sister. My sister threw the covers over her head and started praying and said it felt like an eternity, but she peeked out of the covers and the little girl was gone, so she sat up in the bed to go to the bathroom. She looked in the room where my son and me were sleeping, and the little girl was in the corner of our room squatting. Needless to say, she never went to the bathroom that night. She laid back down and threw the covers over her head, and didn't come out until daylight. Now this happened tonight. It's about 4:45 a.m., and my son woke me up around 12-something and said, "Mom, what were you just whispering to me?" I told him, "I've been asleep. I haven't whispered anything." Well, my husband gets up for work at 4 a.m. He has to be at work by 5 a.m. My husband and my son both watched me pick my son's AirPods up off the floor and put them in his AirPod case. Our son lays back down until 4:25, and something wakes him up, and my son came in the living room and says, "Mom, where is my other AirPod? I watched you put both of them in my case, and we went in his bedroom to look, and it was laying in the floor, and none of us had touched them since I stuck them back in the case. When I woke up at 4 a.m. A few years ago, I was living in an older house in a small university town in northern Idaho. I had been living in that house with 3 other roommates for a few years at that point. My roommates had come and gone. My mental health was an ebb and flow, just like any other person. At this point, my sister was living with me and had experienced her own paranormal things that I was indirectly connected to. But for the purpose of this, I want to just focus on one particular experience that I had with a little girl. This particular night, I had done my nightly routine, washed my face, brushed my teeth, scrolled through Instagram, the works. It was just like any other night. Eventually, I tucked my phone out of reach and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. Not completely unusual. I usually wake up once or twice during the night. It's pretty rare for me to sleep through the whole night. Usually, I just turn over and go back to sleep like usual. But this night wasn't usual, by any stretch of the imagination. There's one window in my bedroom which faces the neighbor's porch light. They very rarely turn it off, so there's always a certain amount of light coming through my window into my room. But when I woke up, everything was dark. I didn't immediately think anything of it. I mean, at some point the porch light would have to burn out and be replaced. Honestly, it didn't even cross my mind. Something was up. My anxiety immediately spiked. My heart began to race, and any ounce of exhaustion I had in my eyes was gone as I stared wide-eyed at a little girl. Across from me, crouched by my bookshelf, only about 2 feet tall, was a gray little girl. She looked emaciated. Her hair was almost sticky-looking and matted. She was wearing a nightdress. Across from me, crouched by my bookshelf, only about 2 feet tall, maybe less, was a gray little girl. She looked emaciated. Her hair was almost sticky-looking and matted. She was wearing a nightdress, think Little House on the Prairie, that was shredded at the bottom and dirty. She was crouched almost like a frog. It was almost like she was soaking up whatever light there was that was coming from the window, making the room completely dark, except for a gray light emanating from her. If that was all it had been, I think I would have just rolled over and gone back to sleep. I had done something similar to a shadow figure over my bed previously. But it was her face. Her face told me she wasn't some innocuous child, spirit, ghost, or whatever. She was something awful, and something I needed to fear. Her eyes were very large, and she had no eyebrows. Her matted bangs covered most of her forehead, so I could focus on her white iris and goat pupils. If that wasn't enough, she was smiling at me. But it wasn't a sweet smile. It was a menacing, evil grin. It stretched from ear to ear and bored into my soul. Once I realized what was going on, I went into fight or flight. All I could get myself to do was hide underneath my covers. I didn't scream, jump out of my bed, and run. Nothing. I was so scared I couldn't move. Eventually, I knocked myself out of whatever terrified trance I was in. I had regulated my breathing, and my heart rate went back to normal. I peeked out from under my covers and saw that there was nothing there. I was so relieved and figured that somehow a bad dream had kind of leaked into real life for a moment. I got up from my bed weary but confident that it was an absolutely terrifying dream. I decided, if it was a dream, I would go downstairs to grab a glass of water. When I have bad dreams and I don't move around, I can get sucked back into that dream, and from my reaction to this one, I absolutely wanted not to get sucked back into it. So I got my glass of water, climbed back up the stairs and walked down the hall to my bedroom, and put a half-full glass of water on my windowsill. The entire house was silent. I managed to fall asleep again. I don't know how much later I woke up again. The room was again so dark. I immediately knew something was wrong. Again I searched for the little girl across my room, by my bookshelf, and she wasn't there. I was relieved, but I knew there was something off. Slowly I realized that there was light coming from the side of my bed, and it was that gray light. I turned my gaze downward to the edge of my bed, and there were those eyes. The white goat eyes, and the sticky matted bangs. And then there was that smile. I could feel the weight of that glass of water on my bladder at the moment. The menacing evil smile stretching ear to ear. I couldn't see the rest of her body. She was so close to me. All I could see was her eyes, looking up at me, and the enjoyment she was receiving from scaring the ever-living heck out of me. and this time I screamed. I yelled my sister's name and threw the covers back over my head and cried. This wasn't right. I had done everything right. I went and got a glass of water. I shouldn't still be in this awful dream. I don't know how long I stayed under my covers. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next morning I woke to the morning sunlight streaming through my window and birds chirping outside. It took a minute to remember what had occurred the night before. I immediately went to tell my sister what happened, and that I was very annoyed she didn't come to my rescue. After I told my sister, I came back into my room and noticed the glass of water had fallen onto the carpeted floor. So I did get a glass of water. I wasn't just dreaming. I must have knocked it over when I reacted so fearfully to the second approach from the girl. Anyway, that's what happened. I'm wondering if anyone else has had an experience with something similar. A ghost girl. My cousin suggested it was a demon in the form of a girl, feeding off my fear. I'm not sure about that, but I'm sure of one thing. I never want to see her again. I grew up in central Indiana in the 9-county region. My parents had kids before they were ready, and it resulted in us not having much money growing up. My parents struggled to make ends meet, and it resulted in my grandparents raising me for large portions of the day, so that my parents could work. My grandparents' home had a storied past. It was built in the mid-1800s. Prior to the onset of the Civil War, supposedly, the first owner was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and this resulted in the house having false walls that opened up to small enclosed areas. It was bizarre, and my friends thought it was the coolest thing to have, these tiny passages throughout the house. My father actually grew up in the place too. It was a 2-story single-family dwelling with an attic and a basement. Growing up, my father and grandfather would crack jokes about Mr. Cooper. I didn't know anyone by that name, and when asked, my father would always say that the guy was just the previous owner of the home. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just knew that my father wasn't overly fond of the second floor of the home, and wouldn't take anything upstairs to the second floor unless the sun was out. Again, I was a child and thought nothing of this. I only stayed on the first floor anyway. My grandparents died when I was a child and left the home to my father because of his financial issues at the time. There were 3 bedrooms at the top of the stairs with a staircase leading down to the first level. My brother and I were forced to share one of these rooms because the middle bedroom had been converted into a junk room over time by my grandparents. They were born prior to the onset of the Great Depression and rationing in World War II. As a result, they kept everything and just stored it in this one room. The door was hard to open because of the amount of junk in there, and it was stacked so densely that there wasn't really anywhere to walk. If you've ever seen an episode of Hoarders, that one room looked like that, just without the dead animals and decaying food. My sister had the 3rd bedroom to herself, which we referred to as the blue room, because the walls were painted blue. My grandmother seemed to dread that particular room, but I thought nothing of it at the time. My bedroom and the blue room were the locations of the only 2 false walls I knew about. Both of the closets had a wall that required a minimal amount of force to expose a smaller closet on the other side. Because my grandmother died when I was a child, I never thought to ask why she hated that room. I know why she hated it now. It only took a year to find out. On Christmas Eve in 2001, I was sleeping in the blue room with my brother and sister. The house predated central heating and cooling. Instead, the house had a fireplace that heated the entire house through a network of pipes that fed the smoke through a couple of chimneys. We also depended on window-mounted air conditioners to cool the house in each room. These were the same units my grandparents bought with analog dials to set temperatures that made a click sound every time you turned it. As such, we tended to congregate into whichever room was cooler or hotter to sleep in. On that particular night, it was the blue room. That night, I was awoken by the bedroom door slipping open slightly. We had pets, so my assumption was that one of the animals wanted to warm up too. As I attempted to go to sleep, I heard the air conditioner come on and the clicking of the temperature dials. I sat up to look over at the machine and saw nothing there, just the dials turning back and forth. I yelled for my sister to get up, and the dials suddenly stopped turning. At that moment, the door just shut the rest of the way on its own. My brother was still sound asleep. My sister and I sat there terrified. We had to yell for our parents to turn on the stairway light, which was on the other side of that door, before either of us would leave. Needless to say, I never slept in that room again. Flash forward a couple of years to somewhere in 2003 or 2004. My dad worked his tail off to get a high-paying position that results in us doing some renovations to the house, including my bedroom. In that time, the only unusual activity I had ever heard was footsteps upstairs once in a while during the night and periods where I felt like I was being watched, or I wasn't alone, despite knowing that no one else was there. Because of the renovations, the curtain rods had not yet been installed on my bedroom windows. The only bedroom windows that I have faced a county road that ran just in front of the house, which resulted in any car by having its headlights flood my room with light. It was late that night, and I woke up to a scratching sound coming from the wall behind my bed. The sound was so loud that my brother woke up too. This wasn't especially odd, as we had some vermin get into the walls during the renovations, and we're still in the process of getting them out. However, it didn't stop at scratching. What was scratching turned into what sounded like finger tapping on the wall, and then full-blown knocking to this day. I believe those sounds came from the hidden room. My brother and I shot up out of bed as soon as we heard the knocking, and were grabbing our stuff to leave at that moment. I immediately got the feeling that we weren't alone again. A passing car suddenly filled the room with light, and because of the physics of the light coming from the passing car, it basically provided a light to the room in stages, and then faded out. As the light began to fade, my brother and I saw a dark humanoid figure standing by the window. It didn't have any features at all. I just remember it being a figure, and it was gone once all of the light was gone from the room. My brother and I then dashed out of the room screaming. From that point on, we refused to sleep up there at all, and slept downstairs in the living room. Quite frankly, I didn't want to go up there for anything anymore. Flash forward again to 2010. I don't go up there for anything beyond clothes, and, like my father, will only go so long as the sun is out. The unexplained footsteps still happen once in a while, but nothing prepared me for what was going to happen on one particular night. I had already been a couple of years into college at this point, and went to an out-of-state university, just to get away from the place. So I was only there for several weeks out of the entire year. My brother was going through some mental health stuff at the time and destroyed the door at the bottom of the staircase leading upstairs by tearing it off of the hinges. My father just left it in the stairwell to fix it later, but never got around to it. I was sleeping on the couch in the downstairs living room where I had been sleeping since that incident in 2004. My brother and sister were out with friends, and my parents had gone out on a date that night, leaving me alone with the animals. I woke up to my cats hissing at what I assumed was one another, but on closer inspection appeared to be the dining room, where that doorway to the staircase was at. Suddenly, I heard a series of footsteps in the junk room directly above the living room, where I was. I was caught off guard because, again, there wasn't anywhere to walk in that room. I then heard the creaking of the door leading to that junk room, which again made no sense. The door opens heading into the room, and there was so much crap in there that my father couldn't bear to part with after the death of his parents that you couldn't open it easily. I was already getting up to head out into the dining room because the front door to the house was there. I had no intention of staying in that place by myself with Mr. Cooper. Suddenly, those footsteps sounded like they were jogging down the stairs to come into the dining room with me. As they got louder, I realized they were getting closer to the ground level, and I made a beeline for the front door. Just as I was leaving, I heard the sound of a crash as the broken door flew across the room into a curio cabinet that smashed one of the glass walls. The footsteps were so loud, I could hear them darting back up the stairs. I drove away from that area to a department store a few miles away and told my parents to meet me there. I refused to ever be in that home alone. Thankfully, once I got back to college again, my parents informed me that my father had a new job across the country and I wouldn't have to go back. I don't know what Mr. Cooper is, but the house was ultimately torn down. We couldn't sell it because nobody wanted it. The person who ultimately bought it wanted it exclusively for the land, and not the structures on it. It was to their benefit. I couldn't imagine putting anyone else through what I saw, and I don't know that my parents would have been forthright over it out of fear it would scare buyers away. In any case, I'd say that Mr. Cooper got what he wanted, 'cause we all left, but he's homeless now. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please give a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Perhaps click the bell for notifications, and remember, hell is empty, and the devils are here.